Upon this ground over 150 years ago, and more than 800 miles from the rocky coastline and timbered forests of down East Maine that they called home, the men of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery became part of an incredible story. One that, until now, has gone mostly untold. A story of courage, of sacrifice. A story that consecrated this ground with the blood of men from Maine in the service of their country. The 1st Maine Heavy Artillery started out as the 18th Maine Regiment and was raised as part of Abraham Lincoln's call in the spring of 1862 for additional 3-year regiments from each state. The men of the 18th Maine were drawn from up and down eastern Maine. Some came from towns in the Penobscot River Valley. Some came from Bangor and the surrounding area. Others came from along the central coast, including the towns of Ellsworth and Mount Desert Island. As with most regiments early in the war, the officers were known to the men from civilian life. As the 18th Maine forms, Daniel Chaplin, then serving as a major in the 2nd Maine Regiment, is promoted to colonel and placed in command.
The colonel of the 1st Maine Heavy is a guy by the name of Dan Chaplin. He's a businessman out of Bangor, considered as a merchant of some kind, but he has the respect and regard of the men who are serving under him. He's considered to have integrity, he cares for them, they will follow him. They will take his orders and they will do what he says.
In August of 1862, the 18th Maine left the state and headed for Washington, D.C. When they arrived, the defenses protecting the federal capital were still in need of strengthening, and quickly the men of the 18th got to work, cutting trees and digging entrenchments. Their efficiency with the saw and spade allowed them to remain in and around the capital while other regiments were moved to the front.
And these guys set up camp around D.C., and they're in Georgetown, they're in Arlington, and they're part of the perimeter defense, and they do a lot of drilling. And from their perspective, wartime's pretty easy. They like it. They've figured out how to do the things that they did at home. They can cut trees, they can dig ditches, they can build breastworks and redoubts and abatis, and they were able to figure out how to take care of themselves even better than that because they had some real ingenious guys in the regiment.
The 18th Maine Infantry Regiment is renamed the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery Regiment and spends much of 1863 in ready watchfulness as the war and talk of battles swirls around them. Chancellorsville, Winchester, Aldie, Middleburg, Vicksburg, Gettysburg.
There was some grousing about that because that's not what these guys signed up for. But at the same time, they were thinking, yeah, okay. But to become a heavy artillery regiment, the number of men in each company was increased by 50, and they added 2 additional companies. So by then, you're now talking not 1,000 men, but close to 1,800.
Even though they were not being moved to the front, Daniel Chaplin and the other officers spent many hours drilling the men, making sure their military skills and discipline did not slip. In March of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant is named overall commander of the Union forces, and he comes east. One of his first priorities is to pursue General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and after 3 years of bitter and heated engagements, he realizes that he will need a lot more men to get the job done.
Union Command decided that some of these guys who had been on the perimeter defense, like the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery, the 1st Maine, let's press them into service as infantry regiments, which meant, guys, pack up, hit the road, we're going to give you your muskets, and you're going to be part of the army.
When the heavy artillery regiments first come online, they're not well received. They're joining an army now that had seen some heavy fighting. A few weeks prior to the Battle of the Wilderness, which kicked off the Overland Campaign. The year before, you had Gettysburg, and then beyond that, you had battles like Antietam. So there were veteran regiments that had seen a lot of their comrades who are no longer with them. The regiments that used to be at 1,000 men are down to 200 now. To see these new regiments coming on board, they were called names, they were made fun of. They were called things like old Abe's pets because they had spent time in Washington. They were called paper collar soldiers because they had came down in their full frock coats, trimmed red with the artillery service. They were called bandbox soldiers because everyone knew they could march, but could they fight?
By May of 1864, the garrison troops were being ordered to the front, including the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. On May 19th, the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery is held in reserve at Spotsylvania, guarding the Army's wagon trains. Confederate General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps learns of the supplies. The rebels are hungry, thirsty, and angry. Standing between them and the supply train are the untested infantry, 5 Union heavy artillery regiments, including the men of the 1st Maine.
So they quickly get a baptism of fire.
The men of the 1st Maine fought bravely against Ewell's veterans. The cost of their bravery was measured in blood. Almost 500 casualties to the 1st Maine's ranks. They did their duty. They held the line. Over the next month, the Maine soldiers would see action at North Anna, Totopotomoy Creek, and Cold Harbor. The ever-forward trudge of the Union Army's Overland Campaign now moves further southward. The 1st Maine crosses the James River with the Union Army on June 15th.
They're still new to the field, but they have been bloodied and they have suffered casualties. Those men haven't been replaced. So roughly 850 men are available as part of the fighting force of the 1st Maine Heavy.
Petersburg is a critical railroad hub that supplies Richmond and the Confederate Army with food, munitions, and men.
Part of the deal was that as General Grant was figuring out how to capture Richmond, the idea was to close off the supply routes, feeding Richmond, feeding the Confederacy, and that meant going at the railhead at Petersburg.
The 1st Maine arrives on the outskirts of Petersburg late on the night of June 16th. And after an unfortunate delay waiting for rations, they push forward through the day of the 17th. That evening, they hear trains pull into Petersburg bringing troops from Lee's army to reinforce the Confederate positions.
And the action on the train tracks means only one thing. Robert E. Lee is here. The intent was, go at Petersburg, be quick about it, and pull it off. If they had done that on the 15th of June, before the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's troops, could get there, they pretty much had the town to themselves. And Petersburg at the time was under 20,000 people, about the size of, say, Augusta, Maine today. And that's still large, and it was still a transportation hub. But at the time, it was defended by invalid troops, senior troops, some young kids. It really was not an army. What they had were breastworks. What they had was a good defensive position. What they didn't have was numbers.
In the late afternoon of June 18th, 1864, the outer defenses of Petersburg had been overrun during 3 days of fighting. The 1st Maine Heavy Artillery was formed up to charge 300 yards across an open field and assault the fortified Confederate positions facing them at Hare House Hill. Previous attempts made earlier in the day by veteran regiments to carry this position had failed. General Robert E. Lee's veteran troops had arrived in Petersburg, and they were ready to repulse any attack launched against them. At Hare House Hill, Lee's massive army of reinforcements was dug into trenches, presenting a formidable obstacle between the Union position and the city. To many Union veterans, the situation was unsettlingly familiar. They had seen the same type of scenario at Cold Harbor earlier in the month. At Cold Harbor, thousands of battle-tested veterans from the Union Second Corps had laid down their lives in a futile attempt to overrun the well-entrenched Confederate forces. General Grant's Overland Campaign not only took a heavy physical toll on the veterans of the Second Corps, but also a mental one.
There were veteran troops accompanying the battalion and the corps that had arrived in Petersburg who looked at the task before them and said, there's no way.
Many of these veterans had been suffering the hardships of war since before the Battle of Antietam and had faithfully fulfilled their duties as soldiers. With Grant's willingness to continually engage the enemy with almost no break in the action, veterans were beginning to show a hesitancy in endangering themselves unnecessarily when ordered to charge strongly held fortifications.
That was not what Dan Chaplin and the 1st Maine Heavy thought was the role of the troops. They were to do what they were ordered to do. That was their mission, and particularly because they had been razzed by the veteran troops, they were not about to step back.
Early in the afternoon of June 18th, General David B. Birney, who was in command of the Second Corps due to the incapacity of General Hancock, ordered the 93rd New York and the 84th and 105th Pennsylvania regiments to charge the Confederate positions defending the Hare House Hill.
General Winfield Scott Hancock, one of the best Union generals regarded not only at the time, but history has been very kind to him as well, would have come in on the 15th of June, but he was suffering. He had bone spurs from wounds in a previous battle. It stopped him from maintaining command of the troops that arrived at Petersburg.
The 5th Michigan, the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery, and the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery were ordered to be ready to support the charge if it was necessary. Almost as soon as the order was made, the veterans from New York and Pennsylvania protested by yelling that they were all played out, and they urged Birney to let the 1st Maine go. The adjutant of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, Lieutenant James W. Clark, paced back and forth in front of the regiment. When he was asked by one of the captains what this movement to the rear meant, he replied, "We are all gone to hell." And with that, he proceeded to pass his canteen to his fellow officer and asked the captain to take something to help take the edge off. The captain replied, "No, thank you. If I am going to hell, I'm going to do it sober."
We are on the Prince George Courthouse Road, and this is a historic road trace to us today in the 21st century, but it was even an important road and an historic road trace even for the soldiers that were occupying it in 1864. Road connects the city of Petersburg, which is off in front of us here today, the downtown area being just a little over 1.5 miles away, with the courthouse in what is now Prince George County, Virginia. The road is somewhat sunken in some areas. It has very high banks, so It does afford some protection. It may be why they're forming up here, but this is really the extent of the Union advance by June 18th. The Confederates had abandoned previous positions to the east of here. They had given up most of those defenses on June 15th, 16th, and even the 17th, and had fallen back on a new line that was established by June 18th. So where we stand in the Prince George Courthouse Road, this is really the new front line for the Union forces. Included in that would be the men of the 1st Maine Heavy.
And they're looking up over the berm because the road was sunken a little bit. And to make the road, they had moved the earth aside and mounted it up on the sides of the roads. And that had since grown over with brush. So their movements were pretty much protected. The Confederate troops, such as they were, knew that the guys were there, but they couldn't really see them. So they didn't know what the numbers looked like, but they could assume that they had sizable numbers.
Chaplain told his 3 officers, "We have orders to charge those works immediately. Go in light marching order with bayonets fixed." Orders were given to load, cap, and fix bayonets. Following the orders passed down to him from Colonel Chaplain, and in compliance with orders that had come down from General Meade, Major Russell B. Shepard, a burly, bearded schoolteacher from Skowhegan, Maine, stepped to the front of the regiment and bellowed out to his command, "Attention! 1st Maine forward at the double quick. Charge!" With this order, all 3 battalions rushed forward, climbing over the embankment of the Prince George County Road out into the open field.
They were to go out in 3 waves. The first wave was to climb up over the berm, move forward, and clear out any of the impediments, the abatis, the stuff that the Confederates had put up in their path. The second group was to push through and relieve the first and attack the breastworks, and the third was to go in and secure the breastworks.
This is the line that the Confederates would fall back to by June 18th, by the day of the Maine assault. But on June 18th, these works were in their initial stages. They were laid out by the Confederates as a good line of defense just based on the topography here. They had open ground in front of them. They're on an elevated position here somewhat. And then eventually, again, as this position does develop, the line tapers away behind the hill. So there's a whole network of trenches and bomb proofs for the Confederate defenders.
As soon as the 1st Maine cleared the road and started their advance, supporting regiments in the rear onto either flank were supposed to move forward. While a few portions of the supporting regiments took a couple of steps forward, most of these soldiers just laid down and refused to advance. When the order was given for the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery to advance, they essentially did so alone.
And bristling on the breastworks are muskets and artillery, canister shot, everything for the Confederates, who were waiting for something to happen.
As the regiment started to move forward, Sergeant Charles C. Morse of Company L yelled out to his men, "Boys, put your cartridge boxes around in front so that the Rebs can't hit you below the belt." Without the veterans behind them, the Maine men found themselves charging the Confederate positions alone, and thus becoming the only targets the Confederates had.
As the Confederate forces open up, the 1st Massachusetts Heavy, the 16th Massachusetts, the Pennsylvania and New York regiments stand down. They refuse to go up over the berm. Nevertheless, 2nd Wave of Maine, 3rd Wave of Maine proceed across the field. 850 men proceed across the field. All of the Confederate guns, every one of them, has nothing else to shoot at but these guys from Maine.
The Confederates, who were excited and nervous as they saw the large blue column of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery move forward, remained in control and adhered to the orders of their officers as they calmly directed each rank to ready, aim, fire, and reload. Canister shot and shells slammed into the ranks of the 1st Maine, punching holes into the once solid line of blue. Ranks and ranks of men from the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery fell as hundreds, if not thousands, of deadly pieces of metal slammed into the column. Yet as the destruction kept raining down on them, the men of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery kept moving forward towards the Confederate works. Captain F.A. Cummings of Company M wrote, "Men were shot dead within the first 5 feet. The crash of 2,000 muskets rent the air. And a long line of flame leaped from the works in our front. Whole companies reeled beneath the fury of the shock, yet the gallant few pressed forward."
And it's almost like a shooting gallery for the Confederates. And everything, an enfiladed fire of the Confederates comes in on these 850 men of the 1st Maine Heavy.
Those who were to support the regiment advanced to the cover of the road, but no farther. Unsupported, they pushed on, a few getting closer than 40 yards to the enemy's breastworks. When more than 2/3 of the regiment were killed or wounded, the order to fall back was given, and they fell back to the cover of the road.
After it happened, by the way, Chaplin was bereft. He broke down in tears. He was screaming at his commanding officer and telling the general, "Here, take my saber. I have no more use of it. My men are dead." The battle for Petersburg on the 18th of June lasts less than 10 minutes. The retreat from that battle lasts over 3 days because the Confederates would not allow the Union forces to come out and rescue the wounded and retrieve the dead. And here they see their friends, their relatives, their neighbors lying about them, and they are powerless to do anything about it. The guys who finally make it back, and we're talking now, when you think 632 guys are on the field, many of them do not return. Even wounded, they're lying there for 2 days, 3 days, and they bleed out on the field. And guys go out at night and try to rescue their buddies, try to find their platoon sergeant, their lieutenant, their captain, and they're trying to find somebody alive so they can bring them back. And as soon as they come up over the berm, the Confederates start firing at them again. So they have additional casualties that they suffer in the 2 days after the initial assault. So you just see bodies all over the place, and the moaning and the shrieking and the crying and the howling of imprecations of just praying for relief. And it's something that stayed with these guys forever. And to know and to proceed anyway, is that folly or is that valor? And for the men of the 1st Maine Heavy, who afterwards regarded, particularly the survivors who were there, who actually participated in the assault, for them to look upon the sacrifice of their friends, their neighbors, their brothers, their cousins, and to say, we did the right thing. It was a piece of who we are as people.